been giving our family financial advice for 10 years at every holiday dinner." I finally looked up his license. It had 2 disclosed disciplinary actions. "My name is Sabrina Lockwood. I'm 44 years and I work as a bank fraud and compliance officer in Sacramento, California. For the better part of 15 years, my job has consisted of doing exactly one thing in 100 different forms: looking at a transaction, a relationship, an account, a pattern of behavior, and asking the question most people don't ask because most people are conditioned not to ask it: does this actually add up, or does it just look like it adds up? Like and subscribe the channel and tell us in comments from where you are watching this video. I want to be honest about something before I tell you the rest of this story, because I think it matters to how you understand everything that follows. I did not go looking for a fight with my husband's family. I did not wake up one morning and decide to dismantle a relationship that had structured every major financial decision in our extended family for a decade. What happened is much simpler and much more boring than that, in the way that most consequential discoveries are boring right up until the moment. I did my job. I did, in my own family, the exact same thing I do for strangers at the bank 40 hours a week. I looked something up, and what I found didn't just change a Thanksgiving conversation. It changed the financial future of 3 different people in my husband's family, and it cost a man named Howard Gressler the only role he'd built for himself in 20 years, the role of the smartest man in the room. This is the story of how a decade of "trust me, I've got you" finally into a woman whose entire career on never trusting anyone who said that without proof. Howard Gressler was not family. I want to start there because it's the single most important fact in this entire story, and it's the fact that got buried, year after year, under a mountain of holidays and habit until almost nobody in my husband's family remembered it was true anymore. Howard had been my husband's father's best friend since they were both 19 years old, working the loading dock of a furniture warehouse outside Stockton in the early 1980s. They stayed close for the next 40 years. Through Howard's 2 marriages and 2 divorces, through my father-in-law's 31-year career as a high school shop teacher, through the births of my husband Dale and his 2 sisters, through every graduation, every funeral, every 4th of July barbecue in a backyard that's hosted 4 decades of the same extended circle of friends and family. By the time I met Dale, when we were both 29, Howard wasn't Dad's old friend anymore. He was furniture. He was at every holiday table, every birthday, every casual Sunday dinner, the same as uncle or cousin, except he wasn't an uncle or a cousin. He was a man named Howard who had simply never left. Howard had spent most of his career in financial services, first as a stockbroker in the late 80s and early 90s, then transitioning into something closer to independent financial advising by the time I came into the family's orbit. He talked about money the way some men talk about sports, constantly, easily, with the specific confident cadence of someone who has decided, somewhere along the way, that being the person with the answers is part of his identity. And because he'd known Dale's father since they were teenagers working a loading dock together, because he'd been at Dale's christening, because he taught Dale how to throw a curveball in a backyard that no longer exists, Howard had something far more valuable to him, professionally, than any single client relationship could have given him. He had 30 years of unquestioned trust baked in before a single financial conversation ever took place. I remember the first time I watched it in action, at a Memorial Day barbecue about 6 months after Dale and I started dating. Dale's mother, Carol, mentioned, almost in passing, The way you mentioned something while handing someone of potato salad. That she and Dale's father had been talking about whether to roll over part of Walt's pension into something else now that retirement was getting closer. Howard, who'd been standing nearby with a beer in his hand, talking to someone else entirely, turned around within about 4 seconds. "Don't do anything with that until you talk to me," he said in a tone that was warm, easy, almost teasing, the tone of a man a friend a favor, not selling a service. "There's a couple of products out right now that would actually work a lot better for you guys than just leaving it where it is. I'll put something together." Carol thanked him, Walt thanked him, and that was it. No further conversation needed, no second opinion sought, no comparison shopping done, because why would you comparison shop against 40 years of friendship? Howard wasn't a salesman in that backyard. He was Howard. He'd known these people since before their children were born. The idea of needing to verify his credentials would have felt, to nearly everyone standing in that yard, like an actual insult. Like checking your own brother's ID before letting him babysit your kids. I watched the conversation continue for another few minutes while I stood near the cooler, half listening, half pretending to be absorbed in a conversation with Dale's cousin about something else entirely. Howard never once said the word fee. He never said commission. He talked about products the way you'd talk about a restaurant you'd recently discovered, something he was excited to share, purely because he thought they'd enjoy it. He used phrases like, "This'll take care of you," and "I wouldn't put you in anything I wouldn't put my own mother in," which is the kind of line that sounds reassuring exactly, because it's designed to end the conversation rather than open it. Nobody at that barbecue asked him a single follow-up. Why would they have? He'd been at every birthday party those two children ever had. I didn't say anything that day. I'd known Dale's family for 6 months. It wasn't my place, and frankly, it wasn't my business yet. I was still the girlfriend, still earning my own seat at that table, and I understood, even then, that there's a particular kind of overreach that happens when a new partner starts critiquing a family's long-standing relationships before they've even finished learning everyone's names. But I noticed, the same way I notice things at work, the same way I'm built, professionally and apparently constitutionally, to notice things. What I noticed, specifically, was this: Howard never once, in that conversation, in any conversation I'd watch him have over the following decade, mentioned how he got paid. I should explain my job a little, because it's not glamorous and it's not what people think when they hear bank compliance. I'm not chasing down dramatic, movie-style fraud schemes most days. Most of my job is pattern recognition applied to paperwork. Looking at disclosure forms, looking at fee structures, looking at the gap between what a finance claims to do and what it's actually structured to do, and asking again and again the same boring, unglamorous question: who benefits from this arrangement, and does everyone in the arrangement know that? There's a concept in my field called an undisclosed conflict of interest, and it sounds dry, almost bureaucratic, until you understand what it actually means in practice. It means a person is recommending a financial product to you, not because it's the best product for your situation, but because that product pays them something extra that a comparable, often better, product would not. It doesn't require the recommender to be lying. Exactly. It requires them to simply not mention the part where their own income depends on your decision. And the products built around this kind of arrangement are very rarely labeled, "This benefits me more than you." They're labeled with names that sound safe, sound smart. Like exactly the kind of thing a trusted family friend would steer you toward out of pure generosity. Indexed annuities, whole life policies dressed up as retirement vehicles. Proprietary funds with sales loads buried 4 pages deep in a prospectus nobody reads. I want to be careful here because I'm not telling you that every annuity is a scam or that every commission-based product is predatory. That's not true, and it's not what I do for a living. Flattening an entire category of legitimate financial tools into a villain narrative. What I'm telling you is that there is a meaningful, well-documented difference between a financial professional who discloses how they're compensated and structures their recommendation transparently around it, and a financial professional who lets a client's trust do the work that disclosure is supposed to do, who relies on 40 years of friendship to skip the conversation a stranger would have been legally required to have. Over the 10 years I knew Howard, for everything that happened, I watched him steer at least 4 financial decisions inside Dale's family. Walt's pension rollover, the first year I knew them, a chunk of Carol's inheritance from her own mother 2 years later, redirected into something Howard called a guaranteed growth product that I now know, with the benefit of hindsight and an actual prospectus, was an indexed annuity with a surrender period of 9 years and an internal commission structure that would have made my compliance training light up like a fire alarm if I'd seen it cross my desk at the bank. Dale's older sister's divorce settlement 3 years after that partially routed to something safer than the market on Howard's recommendation. And then, more recently, the conversation that finally broke the dam, Carol's annuity, again this time being restructured for better terms, at a dinner 13 days before the moment I'm about to describe to you. In between those 4 larger moments, there were smaller ones I noticed and let go, the way you let go of 100 small things in any family you're trying to belong to gracefully. Howard recommending a specific life insurance policy for Dale and me in our first year of marriage that turned out, when I finally read the fine print myself 2 years later, to carry a far higher premium to coverage ratio than a comparable term policy I eventually found on my own. Howard mentioning, at a 4th of July gathering, that he'd found a great vehicle for Renee's husband's small inheritance from an aunt before Renee's husband had even decided whether he wanted to invest it versus pay down debt. Howard, at nearly every gathering for a decade, positioning himself as the default first call for any financial question that came up, before anyone had a chance to ask whether a first call was even necessary. Every single one of these conversations happened the same way. Casually, warmly, at a kitchen table or a backyard or a living room couch, not an office. No disclosure document. No second opinion. No fee schedule handed across the table. Just Howard leaning forward saying some version of the same 6 words he'd been saying for 30 years. Trust me, I've got you. And for 10 years, I sat in rooms and watched this happen, and I said nothing, for reasons that I think are worth being honest about, because I don't think my silence was admirable, even if it was understandable. I said nothing because Dale loved Howard like an uncle, genuinely, uncomplicatedly, the way you love someone who taught you to throw a curveball when you were 7 years old. I said nothing because Walt, Dale's father, a retired shop teacher who'd worked with his hands his whole life and trusted very few people with money matters, trusted Howard more completely than he trusted almost anyone outside his own immediate family. And I understood that questioning Howard out loud at a family dinner would have landed on Walt not as protection but as insult. I said nothing because I am, by profession, someone who deals in proof, not suspicion, and I didn't yet have proof. I had a pattern. I had a feeling, the same kind of feeling I get at work 4 times a month, looking at an account that technically checks every box, but still makes the back of my neck prickle. But a feeling isn't a finding. I've spent 15 years training myself not to on feelings without findings. Because acting on feelings without findings is how you ruin an innocent person's life. And I was not willing to become, inside my own family, the kind of overzealous compliance officer I'd spent my career training junior staff not to be. So I watched. And I waited. And I told myself that if Howard was actually doing something wrong, not just old-fashioned and a little too comfortable in his own informality, but actually technically provably wrong, eventually there would be a piece of paper somewhere that said so. Because there almost always is. That's the other thing 15 years in compliance teaches you. Very few people who run this kind of pattern for 30 years manage to do it, without leaving a single mark on the record. Sooner or later, somebody planes. Sooner or later, a regulator looks. And sooner or later, if you know where to look, the paper trail tells you the truth a person has spent their whole life making sure nobody asked them directly. What finally moved me from watching to acting was not one big dramatic event. It was the accumulation of small ones, the same way Ivy's whole childhood. Though that's a different story, a different family entirely, was an accumulation of small redirections rather than one catastrophic blow. For me, it was teen days. It started at a Sunday dinner at Carol and Walt's house, the kind of casual weekly gathering that had become a fixture in our lives since Walt's retirement 4 years earlier gave him and Carol more time and, frankly, more anxiety about money than they'd had during his working years. Dale and I were there, along with Dale's younger sister Renee and her husband. Howard arrived a little after we did, the way he always did, letting himself in through the side door without knocking, because he'd been doing exactly that for 40 years. Walt had retired with a modest pension and a small 401k, the kind of nest egg that requires careful management precisely because there isn't a wide margin for error in it. Not a fortune to play with, but not nothing either, the accumulated result of 3 decades of a shop teacher's salary. Careful saving. I'd watched, over the years, the particular anxiety that came with that kind of retirement security. Enough to live on if nothing went wrong, not enough to absorb a serious mistake. And I understood, even before that Sunday, why a man like Howard offering confident, friendly, no-cost seeming guidance would feel less like a risk and more like a relief to people who'd spent their whole adult lives doing their own math at the kitchen table. About halfway through dinner, Carol mentioned, almost shyly, that she'd gotten a letter from the insurance company about her existing annuity, the one Howard had set her up with after her mother's inheritance came through years earlier, saying that the surrender period was finally ending and she had some decisions to make about what to do next. Howard's response was immediate, warm, and completely familiar to me by then, because I'd heard some version of it at least 4 times over 10 years. "Don't sign anything yet," he said. Reaching for the breadbasket like this was ordinary thing in the world. "Let me look at what's out there right now. There's actually a newer product that would probably work better for your situation, especially with rates where they are. I'll put some numbers together this week." Carol thanked him. Walt nodded along, trusting, the way he always did. And I sat there, fork in hand, and felt something shift in me that I can only describe, honestly, as the exact sensation I get at work when a file crosses my desk for the 4th time with the same soft red flag I've been ignoring, because I didn't yet have grounds to escalate it. Here's what made this one different from the previous 3. By this point in my career, I'd been promoted into a role at the bank that gave regular exposure to exactly this conduct. Annuity restructuring, particularly in older clients being moved from one product into another shortly after a surrender period ends. There's a name for this pattern in my industry. When it happens at scale, when it happens as a business model rather than a single isolated recommendation. It's sometimes called churning, when an advisor repeatedly moves a client's money between products specifically timed around the points where doing so generates the most compensation for the advisor, regardless of whether it's actually in the client's interest. I am not saying, and was not saying then, that I had proof Howard was doing this deliberately, as a calculated business model targeting my husband's family specifically. I am saying that the shape of what I was watching, annuity surrender period ending, immediate recommendation to move into a new product, no disclosure of compensation, repeated now for the second time with the same woman, matched a shape I had been professionally trained to recognize as a pattern, worth checking, not a pattern worth ignoring out of politeness. I drove home that night mostly quiet. Dale asked if I was okay, and I told him I was just tired, which was half true. What I was actually doing, in the passenger seat of our car on I-5 heading back toward Sacramento, was making a decision I'd been circling for 10 years without ever quite landing on. I was to look Howard up, properly, the way I'd look up anyone whose financial recommendations were about to materially affect tens of thousands of dollars belonging people I loved. The next morning before work, I sat down at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and pulled up FINRA broker check on my laptop. I want to explain what broker check is, briefly, because it's a tool more people should know exists and almost nobody outside the financial industry actually uses. It's a free, public database maintained by FINRA, the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, the self-regulatory body that oversees brokers and brokerage firms in the United States, that lets anyone search the licensing history, employment history, and disciplinary record of a registered financial professional. Type in a name. Within seconds, if that person has ever been registered with the broker-dealer, get their entire professional history laid out in a public document. Every firm they've worked for, every license they hold, and this is the part that matters most, every disclosure event on their record going back through their entire career. I'd used this tool at work more times than I could count, for strangers, for flagged accounts, for routine verification on new business relationships the bank was considering. I had simply never, in 10 years, thought to point it at the man who'd been advising my own family the entire time, because he wasn't a stranger, he was Howard. That's the whole insidious genius of how trust like this operates. It makes the basic due diligence feel not just unnecessary, but almost rude to perform. I typed his name, Howard Gressler. The record came up within seconds. He was currently registered as an independent financial advisor with a small regional firm, which matched what the family had always understood about his work. His licensing history went back decades, consistent with everything I knew about his career. And then, near the bottom of the report, under a section labeled Disclosures, there were 2 entries. The first was from 11 years earlier, a regulatory action settled through what's called a letter of acceptance, waiver, and consent, in which Howard, without admitting or denying the underlying findings, agreed to a fine and a brief suspension after a state regulator found he had recommended a series of indexed annuity products to multiple clients without adequately disclosing the commission structure tied to those products. Commission structures that, according to the settlement summary, created fine incentive for Howard to recommend those specific products over comparable alternatives that would have paid him less. The fine was modest by industry standards. The suspension was measured in weeks, not years. But the language in the settlement summary was unambiguous. and I read it twice to make sure I wasn't projecting onto it something that wasn't there. It described, in regulatory language, almost exactly what I'd watched happen at that dinner table the week before. The second disclosure was from 6 years earlier, a separate incident, this time involving a customer complaint that had been resolved through a financial settlement. Howard's firm paying out a sum to a client over allegations of unsuitable recommendations involving, again, annuity products, again, involving an undisclosed compensation arrangement, again resolved without a formal admission of wrongdoing but resolved, nonetheless, with money changing hands and a permanent mark left on a public record that anyone, at any time, could have simply looked up. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after I finished reading. I want to be honest about what I felt, because I think it's more complicated than simple vindication. I felt sick, first, in a very physical way, thinking about how many times Carol had handed this man her trust across a dinner table over the past decade. I felt something close to grief for Walt, who had loved Howard since they were both teenagers on a loading dock, and who was about to learn something about that friendship that he had never had any reasonable way of knowing on his own. And underneath both of those feelings, quieter, harder even to myself, I felt something that might have been anger at myself. For the 10 years I'd spent noticing a pattern and not acting on it sooner, telling myself I needed proof before I'd seen this exact document. The same document I could have pulled up in under 60 seconds, at any point over the previous decade, if I'd simply allowed myself to treat my own family with the same professional rigor I extended to total strangers every single at work. I went back through the report a second time, more slowly, the way I'd review a flagged file at work, not skimming for the headline finding, but reading every line for context, because context is where these reports either confirm a pattern or complicate it. I looked at the dates of his registrations, the firms he'd moved between, the gap of about 14 months between his first disclosure, during which his employment history showed a transition from one regional firm to another, a transition that, in my professional experience, often happens precisely when an advisor's existing firm has grown uncomfortable enough with a pattern of complaints to quietly encourage a departure rather than formally terminate someone, which avoids the kind of disclosure that termination cause would require under industry reporting rules. I want to be careful not to overstate what I could prove from a public document alone. I didn't have access to Howard's internal personnel file, and I never would. But the shape of the timeline was consistent with something I'd seen often enough at work to recognize it on sight. I printed the report. I read it a third time, and I started thinking about exactly how, and exactly when, I was going to bring it to the table. I want to walk through my thinking here carefully, because I think the how of this matters as much as the what, and because I had 13 days between finding that record and the dinner where I finally used it. 13 days to plan, which is not nothing, and which I used deliberately, the way I use preparation time before any difficult professional conversation. My first instinct, honestly, was to tell Dale immediately and let him decide how to handle it within his own family. I came close to doing exactly that the night I found it, but I sat with it for one evening first, and by the next morning talked myself toward a different approach, for a specific reason. I didn't want this to land as Dale's wife attacking his father's oldest friend in a private, emotional conversation that could be dismissed later as me overreacting or misreading something. I wanted it to land as a fact, delivered cleanly, with documentation, in the exact moment where it would do the most good and the least, which waiting for the next time Howard tried to actually move money, rather than raising it as an abstract accusation with no immediate stakes attached. That moment I knew was coming. Howard had told Carol he'd put some numbers together on her annuity restructuring. Family dinners happened weekly. It was only a matter of time before Howard brought a folder to the table and asked Carol to start signings. I did tell Dale. 2 days after I found the record, I sat him down at our own kitchen table, the same one where I'd first pulled up broker check, and showed him the printout directly, without softening it, the way I'd present a finding to a supervisor. I watched my husband, a generally calm and steady man, go through something close to genuine grief in real time, reading disclosures about a man who'd taught him to throw a curveball. He asked me, more than once, if I was sure I was reading it correctly, not because he doubted me specifically, because some part of him needed to ask the question out loud before he could let himself believe the answer. I walked him through exactly what an AGBC settlement means, exactly what undisclosed compensation arrangement means in plain English, exactly why a suspension and a fine, however modest, represented a regulator formally finding that Howard had done something a financial professional is not supposed to do. By the end of that conversation, Dale wasn't defending Howard anymore. He was just quiet in the specific way people get quiet when a piece of their childhood has just rearranged itself into something they didn't expect. We agreed together on how to handle it. Not a private confrontation, away from his parents. We both worried that would let Howard control the framing afterward, minimize it in retelling, turn it into a misunderstanding between Howard and Dale's wife, rather than a documented fact sitting on a public regulatory record, and not an ambush at a moment unconnected to any actual decision. We didn't want this to look like we were attacking a beloved family friend out of nowhere, for no immediate reason. We wanted it to surface at the exact moment it was operationally relevant. The moment Howard tried to move Carol's money again. If he was going to bring a folder to a dinner table and ask Carol to sign something, I was going to bring my own folder, and I was going to ask one question before anybody signed anything. I told Dale my plan in full, and he agreed to it on one condition that I respected completely, that I let him be the one to tell his father what I'd found, before or immediately after, depending how the dinner went, that this couldn't only come from his wife, it needed to come from his own son, too, for Walt's sake. I agreed. We waited. It happened 12 days later, on a Sunday at the same dinner table where the whole thing had started. Carol had made a roast. The smell of it filled the house, the way it always did on those Sundays, rosemary and something sweeter underneath, and for about 40 minutes, dinner proceeded the way it always proceeded. Rinny talking about her kids' school schedule, Walt telling a story about a neighbor's dog that had gotten into his garden, the ordinary, unremarkable texture of a family that loved each other and had no particular reason to expect the evening to go anywhere unusual. I had the printout in my bag the entire time, folded once, tucked into the inside pocket where I usually kept my phone charger. I remember being acutely aware of its presence through dinner, the way you're aware of a stone in your shoe, not painful exactly, but impossible to fully ignore. Dale and I had agreed, in the car on the way over, that we'd let the evening proceed naturally, that I wouldn't force the moment if Howard didn't bring it up himself. Part of me, honestly, hoped he wouldn't. Hoped that maybe he'd quietly let the annuity conversation drop, that we'd never have to use what I'd found, that the printer paper in my bag could just stay there, unused, evidence of a problem that resolved itself before it needed exposing. I didn't actually believe that would happen. But some small, tired part of me wanted it to. Howard arrived partway through, the way he always did, carrying a thin manila folder under one arm that sat down on the side to the door before sitting down to eat, the way you'd set down your coat. I noticed it the second he walked in. I don't think anyone else did. I watched Dale notice it too. A half-second later, his fork pausing over his plate before he caught himself and kept eating. "The same and went. A peach cobbler Carol had made, served with vanilla ice cream that was already starting to melt by the time everyone got a bowl. And then, exactly the way I'd anticipated, Howard reached over, picked up the folder from the side table, and brought it to where Carol was sitting, opening it on the table next to her plate. So I looked into it," he said, in that same warm, easy tone he'd used for 10 years, sliding a single printed page toward her. "There's a new annuity product makes a lot more sense for you than just rolling the old one over as is. Better terms on the guaranteed minimum. And, honestly, rates. I think this is the smart move. I can walk you through the paperwork tonight if you want. Get it started this week." Up the page, nodding along the way she always nodded along, reaching for the pen Howard had already down beside it. This was the moment. I'd had 12 days to think about exactly how I wanted this to go. And what I wanted, specifically, was the same thing I want in every professional intervention I've ever run at work. Not a scene, not a public dismantling of a man's character in front of his oldest friend's family, but a single, clean, unable fact, placed where everyone could see it, before any money moved. I felt my pulse pick up, the way it does right before I have to say something difficult in a meeting at work, and I made myself breathe out slowly before I spoke, the same trick I use every single time. Before anyone signs anything, I said, keeping my voice exactly as warm and unremarkable as Howard's had been, "Can I ask you something, Howard? Just for my own peace of mind, since I deal with this stuff for work." He looked at me, mildly curious, the way you'd look at someone asking a question you assume is harmless. "Sure, what's up? How does this particular product compensate you? Like, what's your commission structure on it, specifically?" There was a pause, small, nothing. The kind of pause most people in that room probably didn't even register as a pause. But I'd spent 15 years learning to clock exactly that kind of half-second gap, and I watched it cross Howard's face the same way I'd once watched a different kind of calculation cross a different face at a different family's dinner table. It's a standard structure, same as any product like said. Why do you ask? I reached into my bag and took out the printout. I'd folded it once, clean and unremarkable, and I unfolded it now and set it on the table. Not in front of Howard, not thrown at him, just placed, calmly, where Carol and Walt could both see it. "I work in compliance at a bank," I said. "It's actually part of my job to check this kind of thing, and I realized a couple weeks ago that I'd never actually looked you up, even after 10 years, which honestly is on me. So I did. This is your public fin or a broker check record. It's free. Anyone can pull it up in about..." So it faced Carol and Walt more directly. "There are 2 disclosures on here, one from 11 years ago, one from 6 years ago. Both of them are regulatory actions for recommending annuity products to clients without properly disclosing the commission you'd earn from them. Almost exactly what's happening right now with this folder." I looked at Howard, not unkindly, but directly. "So before anyone signs this, I think Carol and Walt deserve to know that, and I think they deserve to know exactly what you'd be paid on this specific product before they decide anything. I want to describe what happened next carefully, because it wasn't loud, and it wasn't fast and in some ways, that made it harder to sit than a shouting match would have been." Walt picked up the printout first. He read it slowly, the way he reads everything, the careful, methodical reading of a man who spent 30 years grading other people's work and never lost the habit of taking his time with a document. Carol read over his shoulder, one hand coming up to rest against her own collarbone partway through, the specific gesture people make when they're trying to keep something steady inside their own chest. Howard didn't reach for the page. He sat very still, and then he said, "Those were a long time ago. Those got resolved. I didn't admit to anything in either of those. That's standard, that's how those settlements work. You settle what admitting wrongdoing it doesn't mean. I know how AWC settlements work, Howard," I said still gently, because I genuinely wasn't trying to humiliate him. I was trying to get one specific fact established and let everyone in that room decide what to do with it. I'm not saying you committed a crime. I'm saying two separate regulators, at two separate points in your career, found enough evidence of undisclosed compensation on annuity products to make you a fine and settle a complaint. That's not an opinion. That's a public record. And what you just tried to do at this table, 5 minutes ago before I said anything, was exactly that pattern with someone I love who has trusted you for 40 years and had absolutely no way of knowing any of this because nobody ever told her to check. Howard tried a different angle. "Sabrina, with respect, you work at a bank. You see fraud everywhere because that's your job. This isn't that. This is just..." He gestured at the folder, at the table, at 40 years of history sitting in the room with us. "This is just me trying to help people I love." "Then tell us what you're paid on this specific product," I said. Right now, out loud. If it's a flat fee that doesn't change based on which product Carol picks, say that, and I'll apologize for derailing dinner. If it's a commission that's higher on this annuity than it would be on leaving her money where it already is, or moving it somewhere simpler, then I think everyone at this table deserves to hear you say that part too, before anyone signs anything. Howard didn't answer. Not right away. And the silence that followed, 4-5 seconds, no more than that, but stretched out by everything sitting underneath it, told the room almost as much as the printed page already had. Walt set the page down. He looked at Howard for a long moment, not with rage, which I think might have actually been easier for everyone to absorb, but with something quieter and, I think, much worse for Howard to sit inside. Disappointment, plain and undisguised, from a man who had loved him since they were 19 years old, on a loading dock together. "Is this true, Howard?" Walt asked. Just that. 4 words. Howard's face went through several things in the space of about 3 seconds. Defensiveness, then something that looked almost like genuine searching, like a man trying to locate a version of the story where he comes out looking better than the page in front of him suggested, and not quite finding. 1. It's Walt. Those were complicated situations. The regulators don't always the full picture. I've never tried to hurt this family, you know that. That's not what she asked you, Carol said quietly. It was the first thing she'd said since picking up the page, and it landed harder, I think, than anything I could have said myself. She asked if it's true. Howard didn't answer that directly. He said something about how the products he'd recommended had still performed fine, that nobody had lost money, that this was ancient history being dragged up over nothing. Who had been quiet through most of this, finally spoke. "Howard, you brought new paperwork to this table tonight," he said. "Tonight. Not 11 years ago. You're about to do right now the exact thing that got you in trouble twice already. To my mom, who has no idea how any of this works and trusts you because you've known her for 40 years. That's not ancient history. That's 20 minutes ago. Nobody signed the folder that night." Walt asked Howard with a kind of tired, formal politeness that was somehow more devastating than anger would have been, to leave the paperwork behind and give them some time to think things over. Howard left not long after, not in a dramatic exit, no slammed door, just a quiet, unfinished kind of leaving, The folder still sitting on the table, where he'd brought it, nobody quite sure what to say to him on his way out. I remember Renee getting up to walk him to the door out of old habit, then stopping halfway across the kitchen, unsure, suddenly, whether that courtesy was hers to extend anymore. Howard let himself out the same side door he'd been letting himself in through for 40 years, and for the first time in as long as anyone could remember, nobody walked him to it. I'll tell you what happened next, because I think the practical aftermath matters as much as the moment itself, and because I want this to be useful, not just. Carol and Walt did not move forward with the new annuity product. Instead, with Dale's help and a referral I gave them to an actual fee-only financial planner I'd vetted myself, someone with a clean brokerage record and a compensation structure that didn't depend on which product they recommended, they sat down and had, for the first time in their lives, fully transparent conversation about their existing finances, including the older annuity Howard had originally set Carol up with years before. It turned out to have a fee structure, once actually itemized and explained by someone with no financial stake in the outcome, was costing them more annually than either of them had ever understood. They restructured it, with full disclosure this time, into something simpler and considerably cheaper, and Carol told me afterward, almost sheepishly, that she'd had no idea, in 10 years, that she'd ever had the right to ask the kind of question I'd asked at that table, that it had simply never occurred to her that, "How do you get paid on this?" was a question she was allowed to ask a friend. Walt's original pension rollover from years earlier, the first decision I'd ever watched Howard steer, turned out, on closer inspection, to have been less damaging than I'd feared. Not because the recommendation had been ideal, but because the product itself, while clearly chosen partly for its compensation structure, hadn't been actively predatory in the way the more recent annuity recommendations had started to look. I want to include that detail honestly, because I think it would be dishonest to flatten 10 years of Howard's involvement into uniform villainy. Some of what he recommended over the years was mediocre. Some of it was genuinely harmful. Untangling exactly which decisions cost the family real money, and how much, became its own quiet project that Dale and his father worked through together over the following months, with the kind of patient, unglamorous spreadsheet work that never makes it into a dramatic ending but is, in my experience, what actual financial recovery from this kind of situation almost always looks like. As for Howard, the friendship did not end in one clean, dramatic break. And I think that's also worth being honest about. Walt did not formally exile him from family gatherings. History together was simply too long, too foundational to Walt's own sense of who he'd been across 40 years of his life, for him to sever it in a single night over a dinner table revelation, however damning. But something did end, decisively, that night, even if the friendship technically continued in a diminished form. Howard never advised anyone in that family again. Not informally, not at a barbecue, not over coffee. When he showed up at gatherings after that, and he still does, occasionally, though less often than before, he is, for the first time in a decade, simply a guest. Not the financial guidance. Not the man with the folder. Just a man named Howard, who used to be Walt's best friend, sitting a little further down the table than he used to. I saw him at a barbecue about 4 months after that dinner, the first time our paths crossed again after that Sunday. He was polite to me, careful in a way he'd never had to be careful around me before, and at one point, while we were bonding near the same cooler where I'd first watched him that crowd years earlier, he said, quietly, almost to himself, "You really did your homework on me, huh?" I told him I hadn't done anything he couldn't have done about himself, years ago, if he'd ever wanted his own clients to see the same thing I saw. He didn't have a response to that. We haven't spoken much beyond the basic courtesies any two people maintain when they're stuck sharing the same extended circle of family gatherings for the rest of their lives. I checked, a few months later, out of the same professional habit that started all of this, whether Howard's broker check record had changed at all since that dinner. It hadn't, which didn't surprise me. Public regulatory records don't disappear because a family found out about them. They simply sit there, permanently, waiting for whoever finally thinks to look. What had changed was something less official, but, in its own way, more consequential. Word travels, even slowly, even quietly, through a circle of family friends who've known each other for decades, and I've heard, secondhand, through Renee, that at least two other old friends from that same circle have since asked Howard pointed questions he didn't have easy answers for, questions that, as far as I can tell, nobody had thought to ask him before. One of them, an old neighbor of Walt's who'd also let Howard handle a small rollover years back, apparently pulled his own broker check wreck the week after hearing what happened at our dinner table and decided, on his own, to move his account to someone else entirely. I don't know the full details of that conversation. I only know that it happened, and that it wouldn't have happened the way it did, or maybe at all, without that one evening at Carol and Walt's kitchen table. People ask me sometimes, when I tell this story, whether I feel guilty about how it ended, about the fact that a 40-year friendship is now a smaller, more careful thing than it used to be, all because I spent an evening on a database I could have checked at any point in the previous decade. I understand the question. I even understand the impulse behind it, the instinct to wonder whether some friendships are better left unexamined, whether some kinds of trust are worth more than the truth that might dismantle them. But I keep landing, every time, in the same place. The friendship between Walt and Howard was never actually from the truth. It was only ever at risk from what Howard had been doing with it. Quietly, for years, in rooms where nobody thought to ask the one question that would have changed everything. The truth didn't break that friendship. It just stopped letting the friendship be used as cover for something was never supposed to have to carry. I think about my job a lot, in moments like this, about how much compliance work is really just this, scaled up to an institutional level. You're not looking for villains around every corner. You're not assuming the worst about every relationship, every transaction, every person who's ever said, "Trust me," to someone vulnerable. You're just insisting, consistently, on the same basic right that everyone deserves, and almost nobody is taught to claim for themselves. The right to know how the people advising you are actually compensated before you hand them your future to manage. That's not suspicion. That's the floor. It's the bare minimum standard that exists, codified into actual regulatory law. Precisely because history has shown, again and again, what happens to people who don't get to ask the question, or don't know they're allowed to. I've thought, too, about how easily this could have gone differently. How many families have a version of Howard sitting at their table right now, and no one in the room with the specific professional training, or simply the willingness, to spend 60 seconds checking a public record before money moves. I don't think that's a coincidence, and I don't think it's an accident that men like Howard tend to find their way into exactly the kind of relationships where checking feels rude. The entire arrangement depends on trust substituting for verification. It depends on love feeling like it should be enough collateral on its own. And 10 years in my own family, it very nearly was. Howard had 30 years of trust, built on top of a foundation nobody had ever bothered to check. It took me one evening at a kitchen table, one free public database, and one printed page to find out what was actually underneath it. I didn't do anything dramatic. I didn't expose a criminal mastermind or unravel some elaborate decades-long con. I just asked the question my job has trained me to ask about every stranger who's ever handled a transaction at my bank, and did it, finally, at a man who'd been sitting at my family's table for 10 years assuming nobody ever would. That's the whole story, really. Not a takedown, just a question, 12 years overdue, finally asked out loud, at the exact moment it mattered most. And a family, slowly, learning that love and verification were never actually opposites. They were just two things nobody had ever taught them to hold at the same time.